Okay, let's start off today with a pop quiz. Now listen to these statements and try to guess what they have in common. I have offended God and mankind because my work did not reach the quality it should have. That was Leonardo da Vinci. And considering that he painted the Mona Lisa, arguably the most famous painting of all time, he must have had pretty high standards for himself. Now here's another one. Money can't buy life. That was Bob Marley, the legendary reggae artist. Now here's an interesting one. Are you guys ready? Let's roll. Now these words are particularly meaningful because they were spoken by Todd Beamer on September 11th, 2001, right before he led the other passengers on United Flight 93 to take on the hijackers. This one is simple and deep. Happy anniversary, I love you. Now that's from the greatest football coach of all time, Vince Lombardi, speaking to his wife. Now what do all these quotes have in common? They're considered famous last words these people said before they died. I know that sounds kind of morbid, but final statements, someone's last words, can be really powerful. These words have a weight and a value that's often greater than just the statement itself. Da Vinci was basically saying he had unlimited potential, and Bob Marley made a profound statement that life is more than just about things. And then Todd Beamer, he made a short statement of courage in the face of terrifying odds. Then finally, Vince Lombardi, his statement, a simple statement, conveyed a deep commitment. You see, these words mattered more because of when they were said. They weren't just shared on an ordinary Tuesday in March at 5 o'clock. These words were measured, specific, and thoughtful. And why? Because when time is short and someone knows the end is near, they don't speak casually. They want their last words, their final words, to mean something. So for the next few weeks, we're gonna look at some of the most famous last words ever recorded. And you know, since we're in church, it'll probably come as no surprise that these words come from Jesus. During his time on earth, Jesus obviously said a lot of things worth writing down, but some of his most profound statements actually happened right before he died, and they are recorded in the 4 Gospels. Some of you may have complicated feelings about the Bible, but no matter what you think about it, the truth is, without the Bible, we wouldn't know any of Jesus' words. And whether or not you believe that Jesus has the ability to save us from our sins, no one can doubt that his words have shaped history and culture in an incredibly positive way. And the fact that they were written down is actually a really good thing, because we all have a tendency to forget, right? I mean, we forget where we put our phone, where we put our glasses, and the TV remote, but our tendency to forget things impacts more than just that. For those of you who have a relationship with God and consider yourself Jesus followers, our tendency to forget can play into that too. In fact, forgetfulness can sometimes be one of the biggest barriers to us having a healthy relationship with God. And I know that may sound strange, but think about it. Don't we all have a hard time remembering all the good things God has done for us and given us and allowed us to be a part of? Especially when things go bad in life. We're like, God, do you even care about me now? Why won't you do something about this terrible situation? We tend to blame God for the difficult circumstances we're in right now, while forgetting all the great things he's done before. I mean, we do the same thing with people around us too. When something is going wrong in a relationship with someone that we care about, we seem to magically forget all of their good qualities and all the good times that we've had with them, and only focus on what might be bad. Here's one small example. Think back to the last time you were sick. I mean, really sick. So sick, in fact, that maybe you had thoughts like this, God, why are you punishing me? Why are you allowing me to feel this way? God, don't you even care about me? Yes, we all have a tendency to be a bit dramatic when we're sick. Of course, being sick is awful. But you know what we aren't thinking about in those moments? The previous 300 days in a row when we were healthy. We forget about all the days we could breathe freely through our nose, had no headaches, and weren't spending hours kneeling in front of a toilet. In the moments we're feeling our worst, we tend to forget all the days that we felt great. But here's the question. When things go wrong, how can we make sure our attention and focus isn't consumed by the bad things in life? Is there a way to face difficult challenges and still believe and still remember that God is a good God who's with us? I think there is. And in a profound statement near the end of his life, Jesus gives us amazing insight into how we can actually do this. On this particular evening, Jesus and his disciples were sharing an important meal. It was the Passover meal. The disciples didn't know this was going to be Jesus' final meal with them, but Jesus did. And knowing this, Jesus wanted to share some important things with the people he was closest to. Imagine if you were having one last conversation with the people you love most. What you say in that moment will forever be your last words. My guess is that you wouldn't talk about your favorite Netflix show or the latest Drake album. And if you're like me, you have no clue what you'd actually say in that moment, but you'd want it to be important. You'd want those words to matter. Jesus felt the same way. And that's why he didn't waste any of his famous last words. In fact, these words shaped history and the future. They completely redefined what it meant to trust God. But before we get to exactly what Jesus said, we need to cover a little background on the Passover meal. Hundreds of years before Jesus arrived on earth, God miraculously saved the Jews from slavery in Egypt. But Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, didn't love the idea of losing his free labor, so it took him a while to come around to the idea of freeing the Jewish people. So God sent a series of plagues to Egypt to help speed up the process. And the last plague was one in which the firstborn male child of every family died. Morbid, I know. But God knew this was the only way Pharaoh would change his mind. So for each Jewish family, however, there was a way out. If they sacrificed a lamb and placed some of its blood above their front door, God would pass over the firstborn male in those homes and allow him to live. Now trust me, I know that sounds completely weird, but during that time, animal sacrifice was a completely normal part of religious life. It was a symbolic gesture that represented something innocent, the animal, giving up its life for someone guilty, a person. From that moment on, Jewish people remembered that moment in history. They celebrated how God had rescued their ancestors with a Passover meal. Part of the meal involved eating unleavened bread and drinking wine. And I know this sounds like a boring history lesson, but bear with me for 1 minute while I quickly explain. Unleavened bread was made without yeast, which represented how quickly the Israelites left Egypt. There was no time to wait for the bread to rise. And the wine? It represented the blood of the lambs that were sacrificed to save the Jews. But at this particular Passover meal, this last one that Jesus was at, Jesus created an entirely new meaning for the bread and the wine. And finally, we're back to what Jesus said in this moment. Now check it out. He took some bread and gave thanks to God for it. Then he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And after supper, he took another cup of wine and said, "This cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." Now, this was a huge moment. Not only was Jesus redefining a holy tradition that had been celebrated for hundreds of years, he was making himself the sacrifice. Jesus was about to become the ultimate sacrifice for every person on the planet. The disciples were probably in complete shock. In one moment, Jesus completely changed the meaning of two huge symbols in the Jewish faith. Jesus said that the bread and the wine now represented his body and blood. In other words, he was saying this: these symbols now represent my incredible love for you, which has compelled me to live with you, die for you, and rise from the dead. Love that is always with you. Love that is unchanging. Love that you don't have to earn. Every time you eat this bread and drink this wine, I want you to do something significant. I want you to remember. Remember me. Remember my sacrifice for you. Remember my great love for you. Pretty cool, right? But this went beyond the Passover meal. Jesus made two of the most ordinary parts of their lives significant. These men ate bread and drank wine every day, and Jesus wanted them to remember him every time they ate and drank. Why? Because Jesus knew life would be difficult and painful, not just for the disciples, but for everyone who read his words in the future, including us. Jesus knew that in the moments when life goes bad and things get off track, we'll have the tendency to focus on the bad and forget the good. We'll wonder where God is and why he isn't doing anything about our circumstances. and we'll forget that Jesus died for us to demonstrate his great and unfailing love. Jesus knows that we have a tendency to forget, and that's why, in his famous last words, he told his disciples to remember. Simply put, Jesus said this: remember what God has done for you. And that's what Easter, what we'll be celebrating in just a few weeks, is all about. It's a time to remember a God who loves us so much that he was willing to die for every single one of us to prove it. The Passover reminded God's people of his goodness. And in the same way, Easter serves as the ultimate reminder of that goodness to us. And because we all have a tendency to forget, it's so important that we regularly remember all that God has done for us, not just on Easter, but throughout the entire year. So the question for all of us is, how? How can we learn to remember God's goodness when life doesn't go our way? How can we create a daily habit of reminding ourselves of how far Jesus went to show us his love? Let's start with 2 ways. First, think of the ways in which God has been good to you in the past. The Jewish people observed the Passover meal to remind themselves of God's love, provision, and his faithfulness. And in the same way, it's important that you and I remember those times when God showed up, when he was faithful, when he helped us through a tough season of life. And secondly, we need to revisit this list and then add to it. It's one thing to remember God's goodness, but we need to keep going back again and again to those same memories. Also, pay attention to when God shows up and does something on our behalf now. Add it to the list. Like we've said, over time, we tend to forget things. The Jewish people didn't just celebrate Passover once in a while. They didn't just celebrate it when life was difficult. Instead, they scheduled a very specific, very consistent, intentional time to revisit and celebrate a moment when God delivered his people in a huge way. Remembering is what allows us to trust God, even when we can't see what he's up to. Here's what I know. You are 100% guaranteed to go through hard and difficult times in this life. So it's important to decide now that those difficult times won't derail your faith or your trust in God. But when you do experience challenges, you can lean on the one who has always been there for you in the past, and you can remember what God has done for you.